Hello, and welcome to American Literature 2. So, we're just going to go over our Unit 1 readings today and what you'll be doing in Unit 1. You can expect one of these videos in each of our unit folders. So, the pieces that I picked for Unit 1 really kind of have a little bit to do with understanding identity, both our American identity and our individual identities, or sort of this idea of like who are we, and how do we see ourselves, and how does that compare to how society sees us. So let's talk about just briefly an overview of American literature and what we are going to be studying this semester. So one of the things that I want you to realize about American literature, or really just any literature in general, is that authors and their work cannot be viewed in isolation. You have to think about the context of the piece that you are reading. Who wrote it? Who is the author? How did they identify it? What time did they write it? At what place did they write it? Is it a reaction to something that's happening in society or history or culture? So basically, what I want you to think about is what is the historical and social context of each piece that you read, and just having a basic understanding of history will help, and looking at the author and their life and times will also help, because I really want you to understand how are these pieces that we're going to read this semester a reflection of the author's both personal identity and their American identity. So here's just a brief timeline of American literature and the different periods that we are going to look at. So we're coming into this course at the very tail end of the Romantic period. I'm hoping that you got to read some great Romantic period literature in American Lit 1. I have a video on the Romantic period and just sort of how it affected America as well as the globe in our classroom. So watch that video when you have a chance. But we're really going to be coming in, and the literature that we read is really starting at realism. So we're going to talk about realism today and what was this literary movement. And then we're going to move towards the modernist period. We're going to talk about this in Unit 2. And in a lot of ways, the modernist period is a reaction to World War I, or what people from that time period called the Great War. And, a lot of people really believed that it was the war to end all wars, and it produced a lot of disillusionment in the world. So we're going to look at that literature in Unit 2. Units 3 and 4, we're going to look at the postmodern period. This is from about World War II to about 1980. And once again, this is a reactionary period. This is a period where people move away from sort of the ideals of the modern period and sort of create their own ideas. And then the last period that we're going to be looking at in this course is the contemporary period. So this is anything written really from like 1980 to the present. So let's talk a little bit about Romanticism, because I just want you to have a good understanding of it so that you can understand where the realists were coming from. So the Romantic period writing included more fiction and poetry and less philosophical and political writings. Literature was for entertainment, not just for political, religious, or educational purposes during this time period. And it affected so much more than just literature. It was art, it was architecture, it was the way that we see the world, it was what people were studying in philosophy. And a lot of ways, this period is a reaction to previous decades in which reason and rational thought dominated. Here, during the Romantic period, individualism is celebrated. We want to see and experience and live within nature. Imagination, creativity, and intuition are things that are supposed to be honored. Strong emotions should be respected, versus, just ration and thought. We also see an explosion of short stories, novels, and poetry, heavy with symbolism during this period. Like I said earlier, that School of Life video on the Romantic movement is in our Blackboard folder. It's a great explanation of this movement. And so you can just kind of see what the realists were reacting to. So the Romantics were transcendentalists. This means that they believed that man was inherently good, but could, in some cases, be corrupted by society. They also believed that man or mankind had this divine spark or inner light that produced individualism, and that each and every person should be celebrated for who they were. Because of this, many Romantic authors, especially in the United States, were abolitionists. They just kind of thought that it was disrespectful to the divine spark that was in all humans, to keep people as slaves. And so they believed that the institution of slavery was in divine opposition to the way the world was set up. In addition to that, we also see the rise of Gothic and Southern Gothic literature movements during this time. Gothic authors were fascinated by evil, by corruption, and the supernatural. So here's this sort of idea that, like, if man is inherently good, how do we get these evil beings, and how do we get there, and what has to happen to somebody to produce that in them? And then we get realism. So the first four short stories of this unit that we're going to read are from this movement. All of these stories in Unit 1 are written right around the turn of the century, and in a lot of ways, they were a reaction to the Romantic movement. People thought that the Romantics were too idealistic, that they weren't seeing things the way they really were. Realism was reacting to the Civil War, this idea that, like, hello, maybe all things are not inherently good. Maybe there are things that are bad. Maybe some people are bad. And so it was really just kind of a reaction to that movement. We also see industrial inventions. We see this rise of industrialism in the United States, and a lot of people were treated very poorly, and people wanted to tell, like, sort of the average man's story. This was one of the most violent and turbulent times in American history, and authors wanted to talk about it. So writers turned to real life experiences to really describe the complex events of their time. They saw it as life as it was rather than life as it should be. And these authors believed that they were documenting history by sharing these real life stories. So, even though these two poets don't necessarily fit into the realistic time world, I'm going to start our American Lit class with Maya Angelou's Human Family and Langston Hughes' Let America Be America Again. And I feel like these two poems are a great starting point for us to just think about, what does it mean to be a member of the human family? What does it mean to be American? What is America? What should America be? What ideals as humans should we be striving for? And what ideals as Americans should we be striving for? And are we personally living up to that? And is our nation living up to the sort of ideals that America has always stood for? So, as you read these two poems, think about that, and then we're going to all talk about this together on our discussion board. Okay, so let's talk about the four short stories that we are going to read in Unit 1. So this first story, this is by Kate Chopin. She was born in 1851, and one of the things interesting about her is she really grew up in a male-dominated society where women were not encouraged, or at some points even allowed, to support themselves. But she was raised in a home with her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, all who were widows and all who were self-sufficient. And so she grew up differently than most of her peers around her. And so this influenced the way that she saw the world, but also the way that she saw women in general. She married 20 or married at 20 to Oscar Chopin. She moved to New Orleans, where a lot of her work is set, and that's going to be really important in The Storm. And she would go on to have 5 sons and 1 daughter. So her husband died, leaving her a widow at the age of 32. She decided never to remarry. She supported herself through her work. Now, she wrote extensively. She wrote all kinds of things: novels, short stories, poems, children's books. Not everything that she wrote was published. Some of it she wrote to publish so that she could support herself, but some of the stuff that she wrote to just explore things she was feeling, explore identity, stuff like that. She has this search for self-understanding that motivates many of the characters in her story, and a lot of times her work deals with sort of everyday life situations and feelings that women, especially during this time, are usually too afraid to express, as well as life situations that affect families. And that's exactly what we see in The Storm. So here's just a quote from the story that I love. It says, "The rain was coming down in sheets, obscuring the view of far off cabins and enveloping the distant wood in a gray mist. The playing of the lightning was incessant. A bolt struck a tall chinaberry tree at the edge of the field. It filled all visible space with a blinding glare, and the crash seemed to invade the very boards they stood upon." One of the things that I love about this story is this sort of enticing setting. It's emotionally charged, it's tumultuous. We see these characters in the middle of The Storm, right? The Storm is a sequel to another short story that Chopin wrote called At the Cajun Ball. And we see these characters that know each other before the story starts, Calixta and Alcée, and they have this sort of history. And part of the reason that they are so emotionally charged in the story is that they have previously had not a relationship, but they've known each other, they've had feelings for each other, but because of the social construct, they really didn't have the option to marry each other. So The Storm takes place in Louisiana. Louisiana has a large Creole population, and it's interesting to kind of see not only how race and ethnicity divide people during this time and this culture, but also class. Class was very important, and class is the reason that Calixta and Alcée couldn't get married even if they loved each other. Because Alcée was of a different socioeconomic class than Calixta was. So it's just interesting to kind of look at the racial dynamic in this story and kind of to study it. Louisiana, especially during the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, is different than any other place in the United States during this time, just because they have such an interesting and diverse group of people living there. So we see lots of themes and images that emerge from The Storm. First of all, we have this story where the weather creates this like charged atmosphere. We know something is going to happen even from the beginning of the story, but we're not exactly sure what. And in some ways, the storm causes the events of the story, right? Alcée has to wait out the storm on the porch, and then it's raining so hard that he's getting wet on the porch, so he has to go inside. Lightning strikes and it scares Calixta, and she sort of jumps into Alcée's arms, and so we have this, interesting setting that sort of creates the perfect environment for these two people to have this affair. But there's a lot more in this story than just the weather that contributes to the setting. This is sort of, kind of acknowledged feelings that they have between them, and this question of what do you do with these feelings. The Storm is also written at a time where it is perfectly socially acceptable for a man to have an affair. it is not socially acceptable for a woman to have an affair. So, in a lot of ways, where Chopin is sort of playing with this idea of women's sexuality, and how, easy it is for Calixta to make this decision. First of all, it would have been very controversial at the time, but the fact that there is no consequences or no negative consequences for Calixta and Alcée's actions is a very interesting choice that this author made. We see her create the situation where essentially, in the end, everybody is happier or better, that they have had this affair. Even Calixta's husband, Bobino, is just relieved that his wife is in a good mood, and obviously he doesn't know what has caused it, but he's just thankful that she is so happy. So it's just interesting to see how this author deals with these characters. Okay, let's talk about our next story. This we're going to read The Passing of Grandison, and this is written by Charles Waddell Chestnut. So Chestnut was the son of two free blacks who had left North Carolina prior to the American Civil War. So one of the things that is interesting about Chestnut is, even though the majority of his ancestry was white, he chose to identify as African American or black because this is what his parents identified as. We do know that Chestnut's grandfather was a slave holder, and many people told Chestnut that he could pass as white, and we see a little bit of this in his story, but he adamantly refused to do this. He was very concerned with the treatment of African Americans in the South after the Civil War, and making sure that black people had as much access as possible to education. He was involved in the NAACP, or the founding of it, as well as the Freedmen's Bureau. Here's a line that I just think is very interesting from the story. Okay, so this is Colonel Owens talking, Dick's father, and he says this. He said, I should just like to know, Grandison, whether you don't think yourself a great deal better off than those poor free Negroes down by the plank road, with no kind master to look after them, and no mistress to give them medicine when they're sick. And he sort of goes on here. One of the things that I absolutely love about this story is it totally destroys the plantation myth. And we see that brought up at the beginning of the story. So the plantation myth is basically this idea that there were some good slave owners. There were some slave owners who treated their slaves well, and so therefore slavery was not that bad of a thing. Obviously, this is completely false. This is not true in any situation. It is not possible to be a moral or good slave owner. Those two ideas are contradictory. And so Chestnut just destroys that idea right here. And we see him do it through a lot of different ways, but mainly this character of Grandison, right? He rejects the idea that slave owners are ever in it for the benefit of the people that they owned. We also deal with themes of superiority and inferiority with regards to, like, who is most loyal and who is most intelligent, and how do we understand those things. We talk about passing and masking in this story. So passing is basically this idea that you can look like you belong to a different group of people, a different ethnicity, a different gender, different socioeconomic class, something like that. And so people from society won't question you. We get the idea in the story that Grandison has darker skin, which would not allow him to pass as a white person. So instead, what we see from the character of Grandison is masking. This is where somebody acts a certain way to protect themselves in a certain situation so that they are not put in danger. This is what Grandison does, and both Dick and his father, Colonel Owens, misunderstand that for loyalty and almost stupidity here. They don't think he is quite intelligent enough to understand the full scope of the situation. And obviously, by the time we get to the end of the story, we know that that's just simply not true. We also see the narrator in this story use irony to really question, like, who actually knows what's going on here. Um, and then last, one of the things that I love about this story is you get kind of this idea of this man that will do anything for a love of the woman who matters to him. And at first you think, well, maybe we're going to get that story through um, Dick, who's just kind of not really aware of everything that's going on at any point in the story. And by the end of the story, the girl he loves agrees to marry him, but mostly because she's like, "Oh my goodness, you could never take care of yourself. I guess I will have to do it." Whereas we see Grandison really exhibit that selfless love and the desire to put his life on the line to protect Betty, or the woman that he loves. Okay, so the next story that we're going to look at is Zicala Saul, or written by Zicala Saul, which is Lakota for Redbird. She has a fascinating biography. I put a short video in our classroom that you can look at. So go do some research on her just to understand more about her. So she was named Gertrude when she was born. She adopted the name Zicala Saul in her teens as sort of a reclaiming of her Sioux identity. When she was 8, she was sent to a residential school. So this was a boarding school that children were forced or strongly encouraged by those in power to attend. They were separated from their family, usually against the family's will. If they wanted education, this was their only opportunity to get it. And she suffered greatly at this school, and a lot of this suffering was relayed in her writings. And of all of the abuses that she suffered, one of the most traumatizing to her was the forced removal of her cultural ties. They cut her hair. She was not allowed to practice her religion. She was not allowed to speak her language. She was not allowed to interact freely with her family. Even the children at this school were closely monitored to make sure on their free time they weren't doing any of these things. So throughout her life, she really advocated for Indigenous American rights, including things like citizenship, better educational opportunities, access to healthcare, and of course the right to practice their cultural and religious practices, which they legally were not allowed to do during most of Zicala Saw's life. So there's some questions that really are brought up in this story that the author wants us to kind of think about or answer. One of them is, how do you hold on to your identity when you are being told that your identity is evil or sinful or less than human? And these were actual things that these children were being taught and told. It asks this question of, is assimilation a noble goal? Always? Ever? Never? Like, what is the answer to this question? And then lastly, this idea of, how does one use tragedy for good? And, why do we study these types of pieces of literature? Or what is important about these types of literature, and what can we learn from them? Okay, so here's just kind of briefly what you're going to be doing in Unit 1. If you have not done so already, please click on the Start Here folder in Blackboard. That just goes over all of our assignments for the semester, how this online course is set up, and what do you need to do to be successful. So if you haven't done that, you're a little bit ahead of yourself, but that's okay. Just jump back to that folder and do that. And then in addition to that, every unit that you have assigned readings, you'll have a reading journal due. This is just a brief summary and reaction to each piece that we read. So like, very brief summary, very brief reaction. Like, I agreed with the author. I didn't agree with this author. I really like this story because, or I didn't like this story because. However you feel about it is totally fine. This is more to let me know that you read and interacted with the pieces than it is me grading you based on your opinions. And then the last Unit 1 assignment that you'll be doing is a discussion board. So you're going to post on the discussion board, answer those questions that I've given you, and then reply to at least 2 classmates. So if you have questions for me, send me an email or stop by my office during office hours. I am always here and available to help, and I am excited to learn alongside you this semester.